Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Samuel Hammond, policy analyst at the Niskanen Center, focusing on poverty and welfare policy. Samuel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem at all. Obviously, we've known each other for a while, and you've done a lot of interesting research in the realm of policy. And I think this would tie in perfectly with startup societies because of how much of an impact startup societies have had on the poorest in society. So first of all, I would like to ask you, so what is your interest in startup societies and special economic zones?
Well, I began a project like 2 years ago at this point. It still hasn't come out because it sort of stalled on the topic of innovation arbitrage. So I did a ton of reading in that area. And the idea there is, if you've heard of the concept of permissionless innovation, that you can kind of break regulatory paradigms into permissionless ones and permissioned ones or precautionary ones. And that, a lot of the sources of growth and innovation, creative destruction come from a more permissionless paradigm where you sort of can, break a few eggs, make an omelet, so to speak. And then sort of looking at what that means at the international stage, where you have different jurisdictions and the potential for for countries to compete on regulatory environments. So there's been a lot of literature on tax competition and environmental competition and stuff like that, but relatively little on competition for innovation. And so I have a 50-page paper that's still not finished because it's sort of on the back burner, but did quite a bit of research for it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that startup societies are a form of permissionless innovation. It's actually a little bit of a conflict within the startup societies community because of, obviously, you're creating examples, you're not working with the existing system, you're using voice, you're using exit in a lot of aspects. But on the other hand, you have to negotiate with governments. You can't just carve out a piece of land and say that you have autonomy in terms of policy. What is your view about the dichotomy between startup societies being about permissionless innovation and creating alternatives and its sort of necessity to talk to the existing governance structures?
Well, I mean, what drives exit? It's people wanting to do something or express something that is prohibited, right? I mean, so in some sense, an exitarian, I think that's the term you like, is
yes.
an exitarian approach to startup societies is sort of implicitly about, getting around permissions to do something permissionless, or at least outside of an existing sort of sovereign incumbent. So I don't think there's any conflict there. Obviously, in practice, startup societies, to the extent that they exist, from city states to special economic zones, have a variety of different regime types and different purposes and histories. Not all of them having to do with permissionless innovation at all. Sometimes it's for actually quite a bit of more interventionist policy. So in practice there's a distinction, but the kind of idealized startup societies, charter cities, those sort of things are about importing a better governance structure. That's how I understand them.
I think you're spot on about that. And I also liked your point about creating competition among innovation. Because specifically, it seemed that you have some criticisms about Tibo sorting. And for viewers who don't know, Tibo sorting is the idea of people, if they can vote with their feet and ease of exit is allowed, they'll arrive at some sort of optimum that governance is optimally coordinated between the citizens and the governance. Can you comment a little bit about your criticism on Tibo sorting?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to mention, the reason we focused on, regulatory arbitrage for innovation, for the ability to innovate, is because there's a big literature out there on sort of race to the bottom style dynamics, where when you have a lot of jurisdictional competition, countries will go to the lowest common denominator of, low tax, no environmental standards, no labor standards, or what have you. And there's a lot wrong with that literature, and a lot of it just doesn't find that taking place. But if you shift the discussion to permissionless innovation or the ability to innovate, it sort of flips it on its head, because if there is a race to the bottom, it's actually better thought of as a race to the top, because innovation, to the extent ideas and new technologies can be copied by other countries, sort of represents a public good. So if you have countries competing to develop new drugs or competing to develop new emerging technologies, that has huge spillover benefits. So it's actually kind of good for that race to the bottom to take place. Now, Tibo sorting is its own sort of concept. It sort of comes from this idea of voting with your feet. What I've described it in the context of sort of American libertarian thinking or intellectual history as a kind of municipal fetishism. It's not like subsidiarity. That's its own idea. It's more like, it's a version of decentralization that says like, let's just push everything to municipalities. And if you want like a bigger, if you want universal healthcare, then you'll just move to the county with universal healthcare or something like that. Or if you want higher taxes, right, you can go. First of all, like in practice, Tibo sorting is sort of a theorem. There's a theorem behind it for under what conditions, what assumptions you have to make for it to be, to actually work. Very few of those conditions actually manifest in real life, like frictionless travel or full information. There's also just the bigger problem that a lot of what government does is solve collective action problems, and collective action problems and the free rider problem are sort of two sides of the same coin. And like in that sense, ease of exit can be thought of as like an ease of defecting on a particular free rider problem. And then you sort of, there's a potential for, again, a kind of non-virtuous competition where arrangements unravel, sort of like death spirals. Those are part of some of my criticisms of Tibo competition. I think the biggest criticism is just that, in real life, and the way it's been applied in the U.S. context, is not everything is best managed at the municipal level. Like a lot of the problems we're having in the contemporary U.S. economy with like housing regulations and zoning regulations is a product of too much devolution in authority, in my opinion.
So I might push back a little bit on that. Do you think that some of the biggest problems of Tibo sorting in the United States, for one, might be due to the lack of competition currently in America among governments? Because you have a very federalized system at this point, so competition doesn't really express itself. And on the second point that you mentioned, that the cost of exit also is technological. It's about information dispersal and about the cost of travel. Don't those costs of exit decrease over time as a function of technology increases?
Well, I mean, somewhat. Planes aren't getting that much faster. I know I'm trying to make them go faster, but there are different kinds of digital exit, for instance, that is the barriers to that are falling. So it's much easier now to offshore your firm into a subsidiary or a tax haven or something like that, simply because it's an electronic click of the mouse, and so that's a kind of exit. I've written a piece suggesting that the 80s and 90s were an era of increasing capital mobility. And so that was like the first era of globalization, where deregulation, financialization, and just a bunch of economies coming online, opening their markets, led to this big wave of increased capital markets, international capital mobility. And that in turn had effects on institutions, because you had more international competition, and so you saw corporate tax rates fall throughout the OECD and other places, because capital was a mobile factor. So if you taxed it, it would just leave, and and then they would shift to more efficient tax regimes like consumption or wages or something like that. So that was the first era of globalization. But there's obviously different factors in a production function. There's also labor, and labor is much less mobile. And so this is the problem of Tibo, is because it's focused on actually moving human bodies. Like you actually, in the context of our regime, the U.S. government, you have to reside in the place that you're paying taxes in. But what if there are technological breakthroughs that can sort of de facto increase the mobility of labor, not because the trains are getting faster, but because we can abstract human capital into a digital form and then export it and import it electronically. And if you can do that in a way that's sort of anonymized, then there might be an era on the horizon of sort of international labor mobility, and to the same degree that the 80s and 90s represented an era of capital mobility. And you've started to see that already. It's somewhat like there actually have been good studies showing that outsourcing to India and China in the early 2000s depressed American wages. And that's what you would expect from a model of international labor mobility. So essentially, like there were the first wave of e-commerce and Web 1.0 enabled some implicit mobility of labor. But I think we're just like at the tip of the iceberg. So with technologies around the corner that could enable telecommuting or a kind of virtual reality sense of presence that sort of captures a lot of the ineffable parts of working in an office together, stuff like that, and then the ability to anonymize your transactions, and you could see sort of a radical economic disruption from that, because all of a sudden labor becomes as mobile as capital, and the law of one price comes into effect, and all these differences between countries start to become untenable. So just like there was pressure to reduce corporate taxes, we might have to reform different aspects of labor law, or move away from payroll taxes and stuff like that. That's speculative, but I think that in terms of thinking on the margin, that's where the world is heading.
Well, I like thinking speculatively, and in fact, I'm going to add an additional speculation to the mix. Do you believe that things like blockchain governance or like blockchain passports can increase mobility of labor than they currently are now, or do you think that's sort of a fanciful sort of trend that just exists in the startup societies and blockchain space?
Well, I think there's a lot of stuff that's fanciful in the blockchain ecosystem. I have I've written a bit about Estonia, for example, which is probably the furthest along in sort of innovative e-government policies, and they have their e-citizen or e-residency, so you can become a resident of Estonia and start a business and file taxes and whatever, all from your computer screen. You don't have to be in the country. You can, I think it's like a $50 fee, and you can become a legal resident for the purposes of business. And they don't use the blockchain to do that. They use a system called X-Road, and X-Road is sort of like, it's similar to the blockchain because you have like this database layer between agencies, and other countries' agencies can like plug into it. And when one agency updates a form, it updates across all the agencies like automatically, sort of like a universal ledger. So there are, and that's been in practice. That's been in place. That was developed in the early 2000s, and it's been updated since. So they're furthest along in this realm. They've looked at a blockchain slash like PGP style encryption system for identities, personal identity cards, and stuff like that. And so they're doing a lot of really cool stuff. And that's where I would watch for they will be a leading indicator if things get adopted in this line. But the problem is, governments, like, you can't develop a passport system in the private sector and go and do an end run around the government. Like, you need, for a passport system in particular, to like have government buy-in, because they're the ones having to implement it and enforce it. And I don't see that happening anytime soon in the U.S. or other major, mature countries. In the case of Estonia, they developed their system with a pretty blank slate, because it was in the mid '90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and doing just lots of across the board reform, very little path dependency. So they will continue to be the vanguard, but I have a hard time seeing blockchain governance becoming a huge deal in the near future, except for sort of ad hoc cases, like maybe the fintech sector or banking and financial regulation could become more automated, stuff like that, but not replacing large systems like passports.
What about things that are sort of the mixture between governance and fintech, such as universal basic income? I know that a lot of your research focuses on that and welfare in general.
You mean in the context of startup societies?
Well, certainly in the context of startup societies, because a lot of these startup societies like Hong Kong and Singapore, they use UBI as by using the land leases in order to create a universal basic income for its citizens. But I'm talking in general, do you believe blockchain technology can be used to create a universal basic income?
I guess I say yes. I mean, any system like a blockchain can be used. I just question, like, what's the motivation? Like, why do it on the blockchain? Why not just like have a normal database? You know what I mean? There's benefits to putting some things on the blockchain, and and sometimes we can over reify the blockchain, because really it's just a distributed database. So there are use cases where that distributed nature and that censorship resistance and stuff like that is useful. Just having the Treasury Department use it to send people money, you'd use it. Maybe it'd be useful to like reduce double payments and stuff like that. But the existing payment infrastructure does an all right job as it is. So I have a hard time seeing that being like the reason it gets put in use. Like, if we go back to the Estonia case, using the X-Road system that they've developed, if you are entitled to a government transfer or a welfare payment or whatever, you will get it like within a week in Estonia, and it'll be deposited directly to your bank account. And I think there are some lessons in Estonia that show, like, if blockchain will come to disrupt more of government bureaucracy, that there's a certain pathway to getting there, a roadmap. In the Estonian case, that they did public-private partnerships with the banking sector long before they started, thinking about, rationalizing any other forms of bureaucracy. And so they, got a sort of national ID system in place. They got the banking sector to become, working in tandem with CEOs of the banks to become, to be electronic, and to make sure everyone had an electronic bank account, and then to integrate electronic banking with the systems within the government, so that you could get direct deposit and stuff like that. I could see, like, if major banks in the United States start adopting blockchain technology for their own internal stuff, and more people were, primarily using online banking, and then the government had an initiative that was like, the IRS is really understaffed, and we want to simplify things. So how about we work with the banks so that if you have this like approved bank account, your transfer will just be directly deposited I could see something developing along those lines, and through that sort of roadmap. Uh, Much less so for like a lot of the times the UBI stuff is like, let's just like wipe the slate clean and start over. And I have less faith in our ability to sort of start fresh. I think we tend to move. History tends to be very path dependent, and it's very hard to totally reform a mature system from scratch.
So I completely agree with that. And in fact, if blockchain technology wants to do UBI, it has to rely on past ways of doing it. One way I foresee, and a lot of people in the startup space have been talking about, is sort of replicating the Hong Kong and Macau model, where essentially the special economic zone, they get land lease rents from people who develop the land, and then they create a fund that they can disperse out to citizens. There's been a lot of talk recently about rather than doing that simply through fiat currency, they have a token fund for these special economic zones. And then a certain percentage of those tokens are given to citizens as sort of like a citizen token fund. Do you think that would be a more reasonable marriage between existing UBI attempts and blockchain technology?
Yeah, like I said, I have to look at those cases more closely. My main point just a second ago was that like there's nothing super magical about blockchain. It's just another way of transferring payments. Like if it's better than Western Union, then we should do it. But it has a bit of a magic around it that I think is not totally deserved in cases like this, which should be seen as just kind of prosaic, you know, debates about like what's the best system for transferring money to people. And like I said, there are costs and benefits to using blockchains. In the case of UBI particularly, you have to ask what's the problem UBI is trying to solve. Is it poverty? Is it giving people a sense of economic security? Is it to replace wages because the labor markets become stratified? Those are all like depending on how you think about it. There's going to be different policy implications. There's been proposals for using a UBI to sort of redistribute rents. If like rents are unearned profits or profits that come from just having control of an asset, not for doing anything productive. And the classic example is like a land rent. So there's people who propose funding a UBI with a land value tax. I'm not sure what the Singapore model is that you're describing, but it sort of sounds like it's getting in that direction.
Yes, it's a Georgia's type model, sort of like a land value tax.
Those are all interesting. The thing about city-states in particular is that, the analogy of a corporation has been applied, especially the more authoritarian ones with top-down control that sort of have like a CEO as president rather than an elected official. If we're going to take the analogy literally, and this is also goes back to like my problems with the Tibo sorting stuff, it's very like neo-feudal. But if there are countries going down that path, like start extending the corporate metaphor. Some corporations have a profit share, right? And profit sharing is kind of like giving all your employees a bonus or a basic income. And Singapore did something like this. I'm not sure if it's still in effect, but they had like a growth dividend, where if economic growth like was surpassing expectations, everyone got like $500 or something like that.
Right. They call that flexi wage, specifically for governmental workers. If the government becomes extremely efficient or they get more revenue, they actually get a boost in proportion to that. It's still going on today, and it's become increasingly digitized.
Yeah. So that becomes less of a basic income in the way some utopian people think about it, and more of like something more analogous to profit sharing within a corporation. And then that raises the question, well, what's the optimal way to structure a profit share? Maybe it's not just to give everyone a flat amount, like could be performance bonuses, or, sometimes firms, not all firms just give people cash. Some firms give people sick leave and all kinds of benefits. So just something to think about, especially in a city state or a smaller jurisdiction where you kind of have everyone like the economy becomes very metropolitan as opposed to the U.S., which is like a huge diversified country with, when an economic shock will hit the U.S., it will hit a region of it, not the entire country. So the way people deal with risk and uncertainty is very different.
Sam, I love having people like you on that have very measured responses and are not utopian with his ideas. It's really important that people in the startup size and blockchain space have that measured response to these ideas, but at the same time, knowing their benefits. Before we end, can you tell me, like broad strokes, what are some of the biggest obstacles you see in the future of the startup size movement? And also tell me what you find are some of the biggest possible benefits in the coming century.
Well, I think the biggest obstacle is just execution. So, we're inspired by particular case studies like Hong Kong or Singapore, which are very idiosyncratic, like very exceptions to the rule. There are many attempts at secession and other forms of exit that we don't notice because they were disastrous or led to dictatorships and stuff like that. My first point is like we can't overlearn from some of these case studies. My second point is, I'm more of a Hayekian, and that's why I sort of focus on evolutionary history of institutions, and also why I care about like the generality of rules, and worry about there being about exit sort of undermining generality because it leads to arbitrage. So that one of the most important Hayekian insights, I think, is like the fatal conceit of thinking that you can design a society from scratch. And there are cases of like cities that develop organically and then sort of get more autonomy. But then there are cases and proposals within the startup society's community of sort of having a blank slate, a big plot of land, and building a city sort of with the mind of God, or just sitting down the institutions and letting the investment come in privately. Either way, those are both very artificial and very ahistorical ways of building a social ecosystem. And I worry that there are going to be enormous unintended consequences, enormous unforeseen difficulties. They will tend to, to the extent that they're planned ecosystems as opposed to organic ecosystems, lack a lot of the vibrancy that more organic models have by dint of being organic. So I think that's just a basic conceptual and operational difficulty with startup societies that are about beginning from a blank slate. The opportunities, though, could be enormous. From the point of view of innovation, it's possible to not even need like a whole city, right? You could like some of the stuff with medical innovation can be done in a laboratory on a small island, and then in that case, the worry about developing an ecosystem from scratch is not really as big a deal. I remain sort of like an optimistic skeptic because I want them to succeed, but I worry that they end up, for every success, there's like 5 case studies in using special economic zones and so on for industrial policy, for subsidizing and building up like agglomerations of particular industries that end up becoming very brittle and not organic at all, and also relatively crony because of the favoritism that inevitably happens just to seed a city. So I think those are all things to go into a project really being wary of. But I wish you the best.
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate it. And everyone, please join us next time at the Startup Size podcast and hear some more interesting stuff like stuff given by Samuel Hammond. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.